just to highlight how bad this country's drug problem is. It's a good idea to become an expert in addiction, because you're going to make money off of that. I know that sounds callous, but there is going to be business. This is going to be a business that's going to sustain for a long time, because the drug problem in this country is just getting worse. And the recidivist rates have not improved at all. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm hoping exposure therapy will lend itself to it. So I think intuitively, I'm terrible with the slides, by the way. I'm going to be so far behind backwards. I apologize in advance. So I just want to highlight 3 things before I jump around too much. I just want to go over the basic theory behind cue exposure therapy. Conceptualize cravings as a stress response. That's an important point in terms of highlighting the intuitive connection between exposure therapy for phobias and exposure therapy for addictions. Because the neural mechanisms are basically the same. And then talk about the 3 stages of cue exposure therapy when you're actually intervening and using it as a tool. And then talk about the risk of sensitization. I'm going to jump around a little bit. I apologize for that. I am my mother's son. I like to talk. So it will be up to you to interrupt me. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please, I want you to feel free to throw them out there. So with that in mind, any questions, comments? All right. So exposure therapy began, I think most people date it back to about the 1950s. And it has been proven, really beyond a reasonable doubt, to be effective in treating phobic panic disorders. It is based on Respondent, also known as classical conditioning, that we learn by association. That when you associate a particular behavior with a pleasurable or rewarding outcome, that behavior is more likely to happen in the future. When you associate a behavior with a negative or painful outcome, that behavior is less likely to happen in the future. So exposure therapy attempts to unpair a feared response associated with a feared stimuli. We have experiences that activate such a strong reaction that there's basically a one-time condition. And that's really another way of looking at addictions more broadly, but especially how it's being applied here, that addictions represent something hyper-normal. It represents hyper-learning. That when you bang a little bit of dope or when you drink, you get a huge spike in dopamine, and usually for a lot of substances, especially stimulants, you get a huge spike in glutamate. Those are the 2 key neurotransmitters in fostering learning. So when you use heroin in particular, or cocaine, or methamphetamine, your brain is hyper-learning. It wants that experience again. When you have spikes in dopamine, you are more likely to act out that behavior in the future. And the greater the spike, the greater the probability that behavior is going to happen again. So what exposure therapy attempts, within the context of treating the phobias, is that you are retooling, you're down-regulating the areas of the brain that fire off when you have a panic attack. The amygdala is typically identified as the area that fires off when you have a panic attack, but it's a sticky caudate nucleus, and the nucleus will come in probably secondarily in the insula, in the basal forebrain area, that sort of perpetuate the panic. So amygdala is like the trigger for a panic attack, but it gets stuck in a different area of the brain. And the idea behind exposure therapy, and what I'm anticipating with cue exposure therapy, is that it down-regulates, it slows down that area of the brain. Because that basal forebrain area is an important junction in your brain. It's the end point of the dopaminergic pathway, where dopamine sends signals to the more executive areas of the brain. So when it's overactive, it can't access the striatum, which sends neural impulses up to the cortical areas of your brain, which are the more advanced executive areas of your brain. So when there's too much activation in the basal forebrain area, those signals are not reaching the areas of the brain responsible for reality testing, or impulse control, or problem solving, or humor, or our narrative. We all have a narrative, or an autobiography that explains who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. We are meaning-making animals. We need to make sense of what's happening to us. But when that area of the brain's in overdrive, none of that happens. The limbic system stays white-hot with activation. And the more limbic you are, literally the dumber you are. You lose IQ points the longer you're stuck in that limbic mode. You become more impulsive. Your reality testing is far less reliable. You just are dumber. I don't know how else to describe it. The key is you have to have that activation of the limbic system, and that signal has to make its way to the outer cortices, especially the prefrontal cortex area. Those are the areas of the brain responsible for problem solving and organizing your life. When there's a breakdown at that junction, that doesn't happen. Think of that junction as the point in the brain where something biological begins to morph into something psychological. It's a key area of the brain that allows you to be human. When you don't have that transfer to the outer areas of your brain, especially that prefrontal cortex area, you're a little less than human in that moment. People get through it eventually, but it's the prefrontal cortex area, especially the orbital frontal cortex, right above your eye cavity, that makes us distinctly human. It's what separates us from the animal kingdom. The reason that we walk upright and otherwise dominate this planet, the reason you have a sense of humor, the reason we're all so verbose and have so much wonderful language to dispose with others is because of that orbital frontal cortex. But when you have an overactive basal forebrain, that area of your brain is not getting activated. It's becoming atrophied. Not literally, but it's underused. So the idea with exposure therapy is that you are down-regulating that area of the brain. The research in 20 years and 50 years will actually show that you're shrinking the nucleus accumbens, which is the area of the brain that's been implicated so many times in addiction. And there's actually proof, and this is an experimental psychology, so it's mainly been proven on rats and rhesus monkeys, but that nucleus accumbens grows over the course of an addiction. There are more dendrite connections that develop on that area of the brain because it's, again, that one-time hyper-learning experience. It's such an intense experience, depending on what the drug of choice is. That area of the brain responsible for learning grows because it wants that experience over and over again. Always. So I basically already highlighted that, how exposure therapy is attempting to reset the cognitive and physiological arousal that people associate when they have a panic attack in particular, or really any type of anxiety disorder. But exposure therapy is particularly useful for treating panic disorders, phobic disorders. And then exposure therapy always evolves into something more cognitive. That once someone's had that surge in panic, when you can down-regulate the brain, at that point they can put a little bit more introspection into what's happening and to even identify cognitive distortions that are probably fueling or perpetuating their anxiety disorders. People reach some pretty terrible conclusions about who they are or the world at large. And it's those conclusions that operate on a preconscious level that, again, maintain that fear of living. Any questions so far? So, I think what I'm trying to highlight in a very roundabout way, and I apologize for that, I drank way too much coffee today. I do like stimulants. Is that you're trying to down-regulate basal forebrain area. It's the extended part of the amygdala. The amygdala is that fight or flight area of the brain. It's one of the oldest mechanisms in your brain. So when it becomes white-hot activation, when it's in overdrive, it sort of hijacks the rest of your brain. Because your brain only runs on oxygen and glucose. It's basically the fuel that your brain runs on. There's only a finite supply available to you. So if you have one area of your brain that's in overdrive, it is sucking up all the oxygen and glucose it can. So you see this down-regulation in the other areas of the brain. That's why people get dumber when you have an overactive limbic system. So when that happens, the prefrontal cortex area, that executive area of the brain, doesn't kick in. There's no response. So it's the more primitive areas of the brain that stay active. And that's when people do dumb things. We all do. I'm not saying I'm definitely not exclusive to that. My limbic system sometimes still gets the best of me. So cue exposure therapy borrows heavily from exposure therapy, and the idea is you're desensitizing the effect of triggers and cues. I've given up on the idea of unlearning triggers and cues. You know, people get through the physical dependency on a drug or alcohol within 3 to 7 days, depending on age and medical condition. So when people slip after 6 months or 6 years, it's because of the psychological sense they have on it. The neural tracers linked to addiction are so intense. The synaptic connections that are forged during an addiction have such high degree of affinity or bonding that they continue, they're primed. They can fire off at any time. So it's less so about unlearning, more so about down-regulating how much force fires off when someone has a craving or an urge. That's the ultimate goal of exposure therapy. So instead of driving by an hour, it's actually been an exposure session this morning, with a woman that struggles with alcohol, and driving by Albertsons for her was incredibly activating. She had a routine where she would walk to Albertsons first thing in the morning, which is what we did this morning. And she would buy alcohol and drink it while walking her dog to hide it from her husband. So she would drive by an Albertsons, and her sons, subjective unit of distress, commonly used for exposure therapy, in terms of how intense her craving is, would always hit like a 70 to a 90. She would get dazed anytime she saw that Albertsons sign. So the ultimate goal is to cut in half that activation. Maybe even more so. So instead of driving by an Albertsons and having a response that hits an 80 on that meter, it hits more like a 25, which makes it more manageable. It makes it less limbic. So that's the ultimate goal of cue exposure therapy, is to decondition. This is probably not a realistic goal. This is what's in the literature, but the reality is, based on the way addiction changes the brain, and that allostatic load, you disagree with that?
No, I'm saying what happens. Undo it.
Yeah, there's that allostatic load that has really been proven to be a culprit in addictions, that your brain chemistry changes in the way the brain fires off, there's a priming effect that can last for 20, 30, 40 years, maybe it never goes away. That's why you hear about people who had 12 years, 15 years sober, and then went on bender for 6 months. They turned everything around in their lives. They got their marriage back, they earned their kids' respect back, they found a second career for themselves, they pulled themselves out of bankruptcy, they turned everything around and had what looked like a happy life, and then they threw it all away one weekend because they were at a 4th of July party and saw someone drinking beer. And that led to a 6-month bender that ended up with them in a hotel, unemployed, separated from their wife, probably with a bunch of medical stuff going on. It's that allostatic load. I'm not sure that can ever be fully corrected. I think it depends on the drug of choice, age, general health. So I don't know if unpairing or fully desensitizing is a realistic goal of exposure therapy. I think what you're trying to do is make it a more manageable experience. So you have that transfer from the limbic system to that prefrontal cortex. That's the key. When people can't make that transfer, when that basal forebrain is overactive, there is such high risk for depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar. People like that, dudes like that, end up in prisons. When you don't have that transfer from that limbic system to the prefrontal cortex, you're a little bit more primitive. You're a little bit more impulsive. You're a little less predictable. You're dangerous to yourself or to others. So the next 2 slides basically highlight the basics of respondent conditioning. There's a famous study that John Watson, who was just scandalous. John Watson was just a player. He was just so scandalous. He did a study. This was like 80, 90 years ago, on a 9-month-old infant named little Albert. If you attempted this study today, you would be arrested within an hour. So he videotaped, there's footage of this online. You put young Albert just in an open area. He kept putting objects in front of young little Albert. And one of those put a series of objects and also then a white rat. That's all he did. And then he went through all the same objects again. When he got back to the white rat, when the child was sort of looking at the rat, might have been petting it, he snuck up behind the kid, took a hammer with a pipe, banged it as loud as he could. So the kid, being 9 months old, not having any executive skills, started having a tantrum. So they wanted to prove responding conditioning, that when you pair an intense stimulus with a particular object, situation, cue, you have that learning effect. And it was more than they expected. There was stimulus generalizations what came out of this experiment. Because little Albert wasn't just afraid of white rats after this. He was afraid of rabbits. Watson's assistant wore a white fur coat that activated the young boy. By the way, the assistant has who we got this white for. But anyway, it got so bad for little Albert. Every Christmas, Mom would take him to see Santa Claus. And he freaked out. Why? The white beard, how messed up is that?
I think we all freaked out.
The idea is the unconditioned stimulus, basically any reflex or instinct that you have, is what a classical behavioral psychology of already drives behavior. And we have basic drives. To feel safe, to feel satiated, to feel pleasure, to feel reward, to avoid pain. That those instinctual drives are what pushes us to learn. So when you have one of those reflexes or instincts that is strongly activated, it becomes paired with whatever person or whatever objects are in the vicinity. That's sort of the basics of classical conditioning. So this is how it applies to substance abuse. I don't know how many times I've worked with people who have described how being home alone is so activating for them. Either because they feel empty when they're home alone, they basically feel lonely, or they're just agitated. That there's something about being home alone and not interacting with others that becomes so agitating and anxiety-provoking for people, they have to drink. Maybe that was the initial reason why they drank, but the more often that they did it, had that decrease in central nervous system functioning, so they felt more relaxed and soothed. The more they're associating their home with the soothing effects of alcohol, so the more likely they are to then drink when they're home alone. I've worked with people who described how excited he would become when he heard his wife's keys dangling. That was a huge trigger for him. Simply hearing that, knowing that she was about to leave the house so that he could take a couple of drinks, hearing the car turn over, just fueled the craving. So you hear the keys and he'd be like in a 50, already excited to get tasted a drink. And then hearing the car turn over, at that point he's like a 90. It's going to happen at that point. He's just waiting to see her pull out of the driveway to know that she's not going to come back unexpectedly and catch him down in a fit of whatever. So this is sort of the basic formula that classical behavioral psychologists use to explain how it is we make the associations or the pairings that we do that perpetuate all of our behaviors, but especially addiction. So there is a local celebrity in San Diego. I think his first name is George Koob. He's a long-time psychologist at Scripps. He's done a lot of research. He actually just received a very distinguished post through the APA, so he's leading Scripps. He's done a lot of research into addiction. And he highlights how addictions are basically sustained by dysregulation in the stress system that we have in our brains. And then he'll make a point also that cravings and panic are both a type of stress response that fuel cravings and urges. The beginning points, the points of activation for panic and cravings are different. With panic, again, it's the amygdala. With cravings, it's the area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, VTA area. That's where dopamine is produced. That VTA area was sort of a breakthrough in our evolution. That was the very beginnings of the limbic system, the very beginnings of the mammalian brain. A brain that has since become so big and bulbous and beautiful and so dynamic. Your brain is such a gift, it does so much. It's just ridiculous what our brains do. But the VTA was the crossover from that reptilian to the mammalian brain. That's why dopamine is such a paramount neurotransmitter in your day-to-day life. Dopamine does everything for you. I mean everything. It is a king neurotransmitter. So the beginning points are different, panic versus cravings. But the pathway and the endpoint is the same. Which is why, again, intuitively, it makes sense to use exposure therapy for cravings and urges, because cravings and urges on some level mimic, on a biochemical level, panic attacks. It's the same dopaminergic system. Again, the starting points are different, but they quickly sync up onto the same neural pathway that leads into that basal forebrain area. So the neuromechanics are very similar between these two types of symptoms, panics and cravings. So I really have no doubt that in 10, 20, 30 years, the research is going to be more supportive of the idea of using exposure therapy. The problem is how it's being designed now. You don't ever do exposure therapy in your offices. It's a complete waste of your time and their time. You need to make it more real world. But you also have to safeguard against the risk of taking people who have active substance abuse problems out into the community. All right. So what you see in terms of how the brain changes, in terms of the epicenters and how they fire off and how forcefully they fire off, people who have addictive disorders, who have an overactive basal forebrain, are more sensitive to stress, and it takes them longer to recover because they have such wild fluctuations in their dopamine levels. If you've ever worked in a residential setting or in a hospital that specializes in treating detox, people you're dealing with are dopamine deficient. And dopamine, again, does everything. It's linked to motivation, it's linked to motor control, It's linked to memory and concentration. It's linked to what's known as reward salience. Dopamine doesn't really reward behavior, but it predicts a rewarding outcome. So you can make the argument that the first 2 weeks of any residential stay should never do any talk therapy or any cognitive therapy, because the brain is still recouping, generating dopamine, which you need for concentration and learning. I mean, that's not going to change, because people check into rehab and expect you to go talk therapy, but the reality is on a neurochemical level, they're only half capable of doing talk therapy at that point.
For how long, you said?
It takes, I don't really have any definitive answer to that, but I think for most people, 2 to 12 months is what you need to sort of get back to your baseline dopamine levels. I'm sure there are some people that don't ever get fully back to the baseline level. That allostatic load has been in place for so long, your brain doesn't know how to get back to the homeostatic set point, and your brain will totally change the
Maybe that's why the relapse rate is so high the first year.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this area of the brain is still very volatile. It takes time to downregulate. It just takes time to get your dopamine levels back to an even level of production. Until you do, your memory functioning isn't going to be as solid, and your memory skills, that hippocampus area, is like the central processing chip of your brain. When it's impaired, it has a global effect on your cognitive skills, which is why Alzheimer's is such a devastating disease. Alzheimer's affects the entorhinal hinal cortex that leads to the hippocampus. So when that area of the brain is permanently injured, your brain is not going to sync up the way it's meant to. That hippocampus is such a vitally important part of your brain. All right, so I feel like I'm talking 100 miles per hour. Am I talking 100 miles per hour? So just a little bit more evidence in terms of the overlap between panic and cravings. They have similar symptomology. Think about it. Sweating, elevated BP, tunnel vision, agitation, racing thoughts, tremulousness. Those apply to cravings and they apply to panic attacks. Again, on a neurobiological level, there is very little distinction between panic and cravings. So basically, there are 3 stages to cue exposure therapy. There's a preparation phase, the exposure sessions, which are, again, are intent to have biological reset. You're trying to down-regulate the brain. Typically, when people are in the middle of an addiction, their brain is overexcited or underexcited. There is no in between. They have too much cortical activation or not enough. Classic example would be coke or meth. Crazy amounts of cortical activation, and then the cocaine or methamphetamine is flushed out of your system and you're in bed for the next 3 or 4 days. We operate best the more even your chemical production. But what happens with addictions is you have wild spikes and then shutdowns in the productions of your vital neurotransmitters. And that's what basically the allostatic load is that your the allostatic load is a new homeostatic set point. So the prep phase always includes a disclaimer about how cue exposure therapy is a new therapy. It's only been around for 20, maybe 25 years. Again, it's designed, the way it's been used over much of the last 2 decades, it's just insufficient. It's too safe. That's the issue. People need to be activated for this stuff to work. And I doubt a heroin user is going to feel much activated if you're showing them a picture of heroin in your office. They don't care. But you always have to explain that to a client. Again, we're very selective in terms of who we use exposure therapy with for cravings and urges. A set of parameters that you have to meet that I'll go over later. But I always explain to them, hey, there's not a lot of research behind this intervention. This is new. And not well researched and not well supported. And then you just talk about distress tolerance. On a very fundamental level, that's what exposure therapy is attempting to enhance. The basic function of your brain, for all of us, is stress regulation. It's the basic function of parenting. Again, the executive areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex area in particular, is the last area of your brain to develop. It takes longer for it to sync up with the rest of your brain. It takes, for women, 16 to 18 years to get fully functional. For men, 18 to 22 years to get to the point where it's synced up fully with the rest of your brain. And that's assuming everything goes well in your development. If you include an addiction on Vicodin or some crazy hydroponic cannabis that you use for 4 or 5 years, that's going to delay that development, synaptic connections in that prefrontal cortex area. So, but that's the area of the brain that's responsible for helping soothe you in times of stress. It's a capacity that children don't have, which is why the basic function of all parents is to lend the support of your executive skills and help the child learn to soothe themselves. You have children, you're thinking about having children, you need to get a dog in that house. A big, dumb dog. Dogs blow up that prefrontal cortex area. That's where you have your bonding neurotransmitters, what some neuroscientists call the mirror neurons. You know, when you have a mirroring experience with someone, you feel deeply anchored connection to others. That's the prefrontal cortex area that is blowing up. The prefrontal cortex area is loaded with opioid receptors. Most of the neurotransmitters in the prefrontal cortex area have an inhibitory effect. And that is one of the single most effective ways of distinguishing people who are higher functioning versus not, is the ability to inhibit behavior, to keep yourself in check, to delay gratifying impulse. So again, there's no shame in being neurotic. Being neurotic is really beautiful. I know you don't appreciate that now, but you will, speaking all the interns. And the reason it has an inhibiting effect is the neurotransmitters that are released in that area in the brain are very soothing. The vasopressin, the oxytocin, all the endorphins, all the natural opiates. And then all the neurotransmitters in that limbic, not all of them, but the preponderance of neurotransmitters in that limbic area are very excitatory. They're designed to jack up brain activation. So when those two areas of the brains are not synced up together, you either have an overactive hypersensitive braking system or an overactive accelerator. If people are too limbic, they're like in sixth gear all the time. They're like a Porsche with bad brakes. On the flip side, if you're too prefrontal cortex, you are going to be the most boring person in the room. No one's going to hang out with you. Everyone's going to say, that dude's kind of strange. Probably a little Asperger's. Probably wearing a lab coat. I know it's terrible. I apologize for myself. That's the coffee talking. That is not me. I apologize for myself. But you want to find a nice balance between the two. When your brain is functioning the way it's designed to, you have a nice balance between those two areas of the brain. They work together. They sync up nicely. But when there is competition for glucose and oxygen, when one area of the brain gets too aggressive, too activated, then you have this sort of zero-sum game between the two parts of the brain. That is that they fight, they're in competition for all of that potential, all that oxygen and glucose, because they want to fire off. So what you're trying to do on a very basic level, to get back to my point, this is what I do, I ramble on, I apologize. Distress tolerance is a fundamental skill that people want to learn through really any brand of therapy. The ability to soothe yourself when you feel scared, or fearful, or confused. It's a basic function of therapy. It's a basic skill of life. And people who don't have it, because their prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, again, they end up in hospitals, prisons. They end up depressed, anxious for years, maybe decades at a time. Seems pretty straightforward. You want to explain what the SUDs are, the subjective unit of distress, which is the most commonly used meter in terms of identifying how intense some reaction is. The 0 on the SUDs would mean they're having no activation whatsoever. 20 is they're feeling it a little bit, but they're in control. They don't feel anxious. When you get to 40 or 50, craving is becoming more palpable. It's starting to have an effect. People will start to sense they're losing control of it. By the time you get to 60 or 70, people are barely holding on. When you get to 80 or 90, you're probably going to see someone who's a little tremulous, might be sweating a little bit. It looks like they might throw up because they know they're on the verge of losing control. There have been a few times with a few clients for a split second I thought, they're going to drink right here in front of me. I literally had them order a cocktail and it's sitting there in front of them. I'm telling them to smell it. Take it up to your lips, go through all the mechanics of drinking other than taking the alcohol into your body. And 2 times I thought, I'm going to have to reach over the table and tackle them, and then I'm going to get sued, because this stuff isn't proven to work on anyone. I'm going to lose my license, I'm going to have to move back in with my parents, but anyway, I got through it.
What was your sense at that time?
I did an exposure session with a young heroin user, and I was really feeling confident. And he used to use the parking lots. So we found a parking lot, kept driving around, okay, this is a good spot. There's still a lot of traffic, but there are a couple of vans around us. So we have a real world situation. I feel pretty safe. No one's going to walk by the car while we're doing it, because they take it all the way. They prep it, they do the draw, and then I'll have them hold to their arm if they're doing okay. So I have this young 20-year-old client who's prepping this shot, this fake shot of heroin. The car reeks of heroin, by the way. We have paraphernalia all over the car. And literally, I'm like looking around, and then some guy like walks right by us, like literally within, like I could have like touched him if I wanted to. And I'm thinking, oh man, the police are going to be here in like 5 minutes. This is like ever. I'm going to jail. My son's got to like an 80 or 90 on that one. So we were both like hyper paranoid, looking around, what was going on. It was the most messed up experience professionally I've ever had.
You had the self-suit.
Yeah, seriously. We had the AC on full blast and we were both sweating. So I do carry around a letter describing who I am, what exposure therapy is. I print off my profile from practicalrecovery.com, and I always have my professional license on me. So just in case I'm stopped by authorities, I can highlight what we're doing. Like this morning with a woman, we walked around her neighborhood, she had an open container, which is technically illegal. But I'm going to take the chance that if we are stopped, and the off chance that we are, I can explain away what we're doing. And the worst case scenario we could have is dump alcohol and then allow us to go on our way. So, but there are definitely some risks involved. And you want to explain that as well to clients. If you ever consider doing this, that I can't guarantee there wouldn't be a little bit of law involved, because that actually drives up their anxiety. I'm a little sadistic in the sense that before the exposure work starts, I don't necessarily try to put them at ease. They have a lot of questions. People are very excited to do exposure therapy week 1. But we don't actually start until week 3 over the course of a 30 or 40-day stay.
So she walked around carrying a drink with her this morning? Oh, dear.
I mean, I was with her the entire time.
But yeah.
It was very activating for her. So people are very excited to do exposure therapy. It's new, it's novel, and I'm sure for a lot of you, we're working with people that have tried treatment before and it hasn't worked. Our typical referral has been to 3 or 4 other rehabs. So they're desperate for something new. So they get super excited about exposure therapy. That's week 1. Week 2 rolls around, they're still excited, have a little bit of anxiety. And then on the eve of week 3, they can't sleep. They have 1,001 questions for me about what to expect. I can't explain to them what's going to happen. They need to have some anxiety both before and during for it to work. You have to have that activation or it's just a waste of everyone's time. So a little sadistic in the sense that I need them to hold on to that distress for a little while. Because again, on a basic level, that's what therapy is conditioning or promoting for people, is the ability to regulate stress. And that is the basic function of your brain, is to regulate stress. And stress begins as an emotional experience, what we call emotions. And when that emotion can't be shared, when it can't be verbalized, when there's no one who will listen to you and listen to what you have to say, and there's just no one who doesn't seem to care, that emotion turns into a stress response. So on a very basic level, emotions are the beginnings of a stress response. Again, when that emotion isn't shared with someone, when it isn't verbalized in the right way, that's the kindling for a stress response that propels people to act in ways they always regret. So the hierarchy of triggers is vitally important. You just want to go over, identify 10 to 15 triggers on that 100-point SUD scale. You want to come up with an array, because for a long time that systematic desensitization was used. Truth be told, the research has proven that flooding is as effective, if not more so, than the gradual approach, and more cost-effective because you can do it in a shorter period of time. If you're willing to use flooding, which is hard on them and hard on the clinician, you can get through that reset, a biological reset, within 3 to 7 sessions, depending on what you're treating. When you do the gradual approach, it takes more time, 12 to maybe 16 sessions. That's more money for your client. But flooding is intense, especially the first couple of sessions. People feel overwhelmed. And instinctively, you're going to want to help them, and you can't. So hierarchy triggers, you just want to have them identify with as much detail as possible in terms of what are the more subtle cues. Everyone knows the most obvious cues, right? If I see a syringe, if I'm a heroin user, if I smell vinegar, or if I see or hear foil that's being crumpled. But you want people to identify the more subtle cues, the smells that they associate, or the certain touches that they associate with drinking or drug use. The more subtle, the earlier that people can identify when they're having a stress response, be it panic or craving, the easier it is to manage. So if for no other reason, you go through this exercise to help people identify what are the beginnings of a stress response. So when you can capture a stress response at a 10 or a 20 on that SUD scale, you're far more likely to prevent it from becoming a panic attack. But when you're waiting until you're at like an 80 or a 90 on that scale, the chances of you preventing that panic attack are next to nil. So a lot of this preparation is meant up for the back end, where you're highlighting, hey, these seem to be your early indicators you're having a craving or a panic. This is what you want to do when you sense that. All right. So just some tips in terms of doing exposure for alcohol. I always have them eat some salty snack on the way to an exposure. Typical commute's about 10 minutes for the local clients. But you want them to be thirsty. That's why you have them have something salty on the way there. I typically don't want them smoking because everyone in our facility smokes. I mean, literally, we have someone right now who's in his early 60s, no history of smoking. Started smoking. And he has high blood pressure. So I asked them not to have cigarettes an hour or so before, because dopamine gives you confidence. And when you have a cigarette, you're enhancing your dopamine production as well as norepinephrine, which is why cigarettes and coffee in the short term make you a little bit smarter. They enhance your ability to learn and to recall. When you have a subtle spike in dopamine and norepinephrine, your memory skills are enhanced. And when your memory skills are enhanced, you're a little bit brighter. Which is why grad students stereotypically drink a lot of coffee and sometimes smoke a lot of cigarettes. Those cigarettes seem to be out of style at this point. Don't have them forget your driver's license. That actually happened to me one time with a 21-year-old. I had to pretend to be his father to get the exposure session back on track. It was very awkward. And just some ideas in terms of other triggers, cues that can sort of amplify the experience. The more subtle cues or triggers you can build into the experience, the more activating it's going to be for them. And then for heroin, again, a typical rig that people use is that 1cc 29 gauge. I don't really know what any of that means, but I know what it is when I see it. Heroin users seem to like a particular needle. By the way, purchasing needles from a pharmacy, adventurous. You get flagged for everything. I literally went to a CVS and asked for a bag of these needles. And the manager got called out, then the manager of the store got called out. I spent 15 minutes explaining who I was. I pulled up the website on my cell phone. I happened to have my license on me.
Were you also buying a lighter and spoon?
I was not, no. All right. So again, you want to make it as real world as possible. And one thing that I do routinely, actually throughout exposures, I'm prompting people to monitor their bodily and cognitive experiences. In the short term, at the very beginning, that drives up their anxiety. You want them focusing on their anxiety to give them anxiety. But what happens over the course of a successful exposure is the more self-aware they become, the more they self-monitor. You see a transfer from the limbic to the prefrontal cortex area. You see a transfer effect. Still needs to be proven, but the way people gradually soothe themselves over the course of an exposure is just proof positive you have that transfer. So the constant monitoring is key to gauge where they're at. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Some people can mask their anxiety and stress better than others. And other times it's clear that people are exaggerating their response to what's happening because they want to be the perfect client. They want to really impress them with how hard they're trying in therapy. But you're asking to drive up the anxiety in the first 5 minutes. The idea that on the back end, this approach helps them to figure out what's happening to them. This is why I'm having the response that I am. And when we have insight into our behaviors, we feel a little bit more in control of who we are. And I typically ask what their SUDs are at least once every 2 minutes. Because they can change in a hurry. And you'll see ebbs and flows, spikes. Someone will be at 75, and someone at 50, and then back up to an 85. About 10 minutes left. I think I'm in pretty good shape. So you want to fight your instinct to soothe a distressed client. If you give them your empathy at the height of an exposure session, you are reinforcing the anxiety. You have to be willing to tolerate someone's pain, or this doesn't work. So at that point, your empathy becomes a reinforcer of the anxiety, because the brain is going to associate, okay, we have a freak out. Every time we have a panic attack, this person's going to care and love for me. It's a little borderline, right? I mean, typically, that's what's perpetuating the behavior, is that if you have a crisis and you create enough distress, someone will rush to your aid. It's a secondary gain. So you have to be very careful about when and how we use empathy during an exposure session.
So is it kind of like somatic therapy, where you're going to
want them to keep feeling it until it can, on its own, go down?
Yep. Yeah. I don't know if I call it somatization or somatic therapy, but yeah, you're wanting them to have a bodily experience that turns into something more cognitive over the course of 10 to 30 minutes. It seems like the exposure sessions for cravings are shorter than for phobic disorders. I've routinely read that exposure sessions for phobic disorders take 30 to 45 minutes to sort of finish. With cravings and the use of exposure for cravings, it typically seems to take about 15 to 20 minutes to get back to a more reasonable level. Yeah, you want it to be a full body experience early on.
So what would you say to them? Like
I don't say anything.
you don't say anything?
They're on their own. I'm there. That's the best part about this exposure therapy. You don't do a whole lot. It's easy to decide. You're just there. It's just like easy money.
How long does the client stay just ridiculously close to using?
I've had some that stayed at that point for 5 or 10 minutes. Most people will spike and 2 minutes later, their suds are coming down, but you'll see a pattern where 75, 60, 85, 70, 95, 80, and then 70, and then 55, and then 40. You'll see 2 or 3 spikes over the course of a 10 to 15 minute climax, for lack of a better term. So that's why you have to be careful not to transition out of the exposure too quickly. Because on the tail end of it, you do want to help them recover. But the sooner that you intervene to help them recover from the stress response, the less effective the intervention is going to be, and the more likely you are to actually inadvertently reinforce the anxiety cycle.
How many exposure therapy sessions does a client typically receive?
So I'm going to cover that in about 2 minutes, because that's an important point. So exposure, again, peaks typically within 20 minutes. That doesn't include the car ride. That car ride is where I get a lot of the peaking, the anticipation of what to expect. I also tend to drive like a maniac, so that's probably added. So I'm sure the comments concerns about their safety when they're driving with me, but I drive a Volvo, it's like a tank, they drive it through a wall if I want to. So once the suds begins to fall, and typically that's over about a 5-minute period, you want to see a steady decline over 5 minutes. Don't jump too quickly to the end of the session, because sometimes you get a rebound effect. But when over the course of 5-6 minutes, they describe 3 consecutive scores of the suds that have dropped, at that point you can assume that they are coming out of their exposure, that they're recovering on their own. And that's where you can speed up the recovery with something that one of our clinicians calls playing the reel out to the end. Where basically you're having them play out a slip. So how would this play out? In a minute, in an hour, in a day, in a week. Where are you in a month if you were to have that drink or take that shot? You can also use distraction techniques, non-semantic techniques where you're exercising the working memory. I'll ask people to do some basic math. And it always has to be basic math because first of all, people are just terrible at math. But also when people are distressed, that they're not, again, their executive skills are a bit impaired. They can't problem solve as good as they typically will. But you have them do basic math, you have them count backwards, you have them spell words, and you have them spell them backwards, you have them recite their phone number, you have them recite the phone number backwards. Because you're activating areas of the brain that are in competition with the limbic system at that point. So you're diffusing potential away from the limbic system, so it's running out of fuel, so it becomes less active. But you want to wait until someone, again, is dipping at this point, when they're at a 50 or a 40 on their suds. So you had a question?
I was just wondering if you don't do anything, are you just taking readings on their suds and then you just wait until they get to a lower level, and then what happens? What do you do then?
So
If they're kind of recovered through that.
So this is what we do in terms of the recovery. From taking a 50 or a 40 down to say a 20, and then when you're at a 20, that's actually I think the next slide. When you hit a 40, the session's very quickly coming to an end. Within a minute or two, they're probably going to be at a 20 or a 15. And when you're at that point, that's when you identify the self-talk that emerged. When we are under stress, how we interpret ourselves and the world at large suffers. We come up with all sorts of crazy distortions. And it's those distortions that typically can aid in the anxiety and or the justification for continuing to use. And that's where the second half of the exposure session evolves into. Is you're identifying the self-talk that emerged out of the exposure and then challenging it and highlighting how some of it's really distorted. Like this woman this morning, who I'm really struggling with in exposure work. She is brilliant in her resistance. But she is so self-loathing. She hates herself. She's a lawyer, so she's verbose, she's intelligent, she's hyperverbal. So she is so subtle how she does it, but does it so routinely where she's completely down herself and telling herself, I have absolutely no control over my behavior. Despite the fact she has a 30-year career for herself, she has a family for herself, she has a beautiful condo. It's just hard to watch.
So is that they're at a point where they can sort of take in things and learn better when they're...
And you can tell, they're breathing again. They just look relieved at that point. A little tired, because it can be exhausting. She had a little bit of a headache afterwards because it was really stressful for her this morning. This has been building for a couple of days. This is the third day we did the exposure session. The first two, there was no activation, very little activation. And I was pulling out all the stops. And it just didn't have much of an effect. I could sense it coming, because you can only intellectualize to a certain point. Your biology will always win out. I don't care how smart you think you are, or how bright you are. Your biology will always win out. And I can feel it coming. Again, behaviorists will identify cravings as an extension of a biological imperative. To numb out pain, to experience pleasure, to feel satiated, especially in this country. I think part of the reason that this country is the drug capital of the world is from a very young age, if you're from even just a modest background, you always had food available to you. You know, those appetite centers of the brain have closely situated the addictive areas of the brain. So from a very young age, when you were just an infant, you didn't weigh more than 10 pounds, and you started freaking out, someone shoved food in your mouth. So from the earliest of ages, you learned that you expected to have your appetite met and met immediately. Anytime you're hungry, I'm assuming everyone in this room has a refrigerator in your house. And you can just get up, literally at this point, pause the television so you don't miss any of your show. Get up, go to your refrigerator, and start chowing down. And it's the same neural mechanism that propels craving. So it's no wonder that a rather affluent society like the US has such an epidemic problem when it comes to addiction. You have been conditioned from the youngest of ages to be an addict. It's a miracle that you're not. All right.
I saw on a previous slide that you had noted that sometimes the relief from the distress can act as a reinforcement. And so how do you distinguish between relief being reinforcing and not?
So the anxiety will be low. So that's how anxiety, panic disorders are reinforced. Is that someone has a panic attack in a mall around a dog, and they immediately leave that situation, and the relief that they experience at the height of the anxiety is the reinforcer at that point.
Okay, so you mean relief from the situation, not from the anxiety itself. Like staying in the bar until they are low enough,
So
rather than walking out.
Yeah, general cutoff I use is 40. It's typically used in treating phobic disorders. When someone gets a low of 40, that's medium activation, cortical activation. At that point, you're probably not going to be reinforcing it inadvertently by helping to soothe them or get them through the experience.
So are you writing down the...
No, just sort of checking my mind. At that point, I start asking me every minute, because I want to help them get to the end of their exposure. I just keep it kind of ongoing. The number really isn't that important. It's just you want to see the pattern coming down. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. I know it's not as dramatic as opioid addiction, but have you ever used or adapted this to food addiction?
No, just heroin and alcohol, maybe.
Do you see the potential for that? Or not really?
I don't know enough about eating disorders. Virtually all of my training is with men and criminals. Not like how eating disorders. In fact, they love food. So I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay.
Have you ever had a patient who run away from the scene?
That's why we go.
What do you usually do with that?
That area of the brain that fires off when you have a panic attack or craving is only meant to fire off in short bursts. So as terrifying as an experience as a panic attack is, as overwhelming and crippling as it feels, the reality is you're not going to die from it. You'll always survive a panic attack. Because that area of your brain is only meant to fire off, again, in short shots. So you just have to wait it out. I'll tell people that. I've had a couple instances where they had full-fledged panic attacks. And I'll give them some very benign psychoed in very neutral terms, and they'll seem like I'm soothing them about, no one's ever died today. This will stop. So real quick, I know we have to end literally in like 30 seconds. So the risk of sensitization is legitimate. You could inadvertently activate the nuclear accumbens even more through exposure therapy. So one thing that we do, I don't remember who asked the question, but one way we safeguard against this is we do intensive exposure. It's 5 straight days in week 3. And there are a set of criteria that people have to meet to do it. You have to be in residential treatment. You don't want to do this on an outpatient basis. And they have to be past detox by at least 2 weeks. I'm thinking about revising that though. No unexcused absences from sessions. You want to make sure they're committed to their treatment before you use this sort of a therapy. They have to demonstrate an ability to internalize. I don't care if that's responsibility or emotions. But again, internalization, the ability to inhibit yourself and take responsibility or blame, those are sophisticated skills. So this works better for people a little bit more sophisticated by design. The 7-day buffer has got it. This is a prerequisite. You want a buffer between the last exposure session and their discharge date, just in case there's any residual anxiety lingering after the fact. And I typically have a rule, they can only have 1 substance use disorder. If they have polyabuse going on, I'm probably not going to mess with that. It's just too high risk. So this is...
You said you wanted to revise something about the 2 weeks.
Yeah, I was thinking it was... They would learn more of the ways of week 3, because there's that cognitive recovery that takes longer than the physical recovery. I want them to have enough dopamine and or glutamate available to them that they can make the associations firmly. But now I'm thinking I want their physiology to be a little volatile, so why not catch it at the tail end of the detox? Probably not in the detox, but maybe like day 10 at that point to start. Because I want their, again, this doesn't work unless they're activated. And when people are coming through detox, their physiology is especially volatile, which is why people have heart attacks, seizure activity. They're typically hypertensive when they're detoxing. Your central nervous system is haywire at that point.
How many patients have you had that actually have taken that drink or the shot? None.
Never have. And that's why we're so selective. I would never take anyone who I thought, I have to be 99% sure they're not going to drink when I take them out of exposure. So it hasn't happened yet.
Knock on wood.
Well, I think we have to finish because they're going to use this screen, but I'll answer any questions after